To some extent, I feel a little bit alien because I'm in fact interested in commemoration World War I because of tourism. And I learned when dealing with this that at the end I almost dare not mention tourism anymore. Because to some extent, if you tend to make the bridge between tourism and commemoration, like immediately people look at you like these are the ones making a commercial product of it, and it will not be with respect, and so there is already an anti attitude from outside towards tourism. Well, that's what I experience at least. Most of the slides I will present are not made in purpose for this, because I gave a presentation last year in the month of November in Paris, a little bit about this, and I thought that some of the slides were applicable to today as well. But I must say that I started the research because in the battlefield area of in Flanders, which is a quite small and rural area, in fact, the reason why one was so interested in World War I and battlefield tourism is about mainly the tourism concern, which might be the external challenges you have in your mapping there, because there has been a battlefield tourism for 100 years in this region, and in fact for a region with not too many jobs, being quite rural, these incomes and these visitors are very important as a diversification of their economic basis. So there was from the very beginning a big concern, two ways, like first of all, there will be a lot of attention, so let's make sure that we share and that we participate in that attention, and that we have a little brain there. And a second thing is even bigger, the concern, what about beyond 2018? Will this continue, this kind of tourism, this kind of interest, this kind of new asset almost for the region? Will this continue on a higher level, or will this be a dive into low interests and things like that? So I know from the very beginning that local authorities, especially in the province of Western Flanders, which incorporates the battlefield zone, was very much looking into this, has done a lot of research, has a lot of expertise, did a lot of surveys, but in my view, they were sticking a little bit towards the quantitative issues, like the numbers of people and how did they involve and how did they come and did they spend nights and did they spend euros and things like that, which is very important to know. But there was little into the qualitative research, let's say, and knowing in fact what the visitors really experienced, what the visitors really needed, what the visitors really expected, and what was adding value for them. So this was kind of my perspective, and in fact, being a geographer, I was very much tempted to choose the sense of place approach, of course, to kind of tackle the question. I did a lot of research in a sense that I did mainly mainly interviews, already starting in 2008. But what I am going to present to you very quickly is a research with a group of students in 2013-2014, and as you can see, we did a number of short interviews on the spot. A first series was oriented towards the experience, and a second series was really oriented towards the profile of the landscape as such. What is in there, what makes a tourismscape, to say it very unpolitely, what a battlefield site might be. It might be a tourismscape, just being visited, but you can turn it, it might be experienced as a memoryscape. And what makes the difference there? That was the aim of the research. So the theory on memoryscapes, then, these are a number of elements that guided us as a umbrella, as a framework, and I'm sure that the references are familiar to you. The lieu de mémoire is, of course, a very important entrance if you want to reflect on the sense of place. But I was very much trying to focus also on, as in the second element, the constitutive role of scale in memory making. And then another thing I thought was very interesting, like the division between the space filled with memory assets and the empty space, and how you could kind of mix this together, and what the role of empty space in between the official space filled with memorials and inducing the official commemoration might be there, what kind of a role it can play. Again, some elements like as what I just explained is in fact in the element of the first bullet, the place is the spectacular and triumphant place versus the little places, the secondary places of refuge, sanctuaries, little things. And I think there is the micro memory is very important, might be very important. The only thing is I wanted to see if for the visitors, these small places and the micro memory might be important as well and make sense there. So again, others talk about anonymous space, filling the void. So I was kind of looking at the significance, and if at least the visitors as well grasped this significance. So again, maybe a little bit redundant what the research area is. Like I said, the battlefield on the Belgian, the Flemish territory. And I feel, well, kind of justified to choose this research area, because before the lunch break I told about this international survey, and this is a mapping of the places that were mentioned by the people in the survey. It's very interesting because it's a mapping of already visited places. We are talking about 2012, so it might be very interesting to see now at the end of the commemoration period if this pattern is just the same. But for now, I used it to see if in an international community this battlefield area in northwestern Belgium makes sense as a research area, which probably based on this information is. Now, we couldn't visit and research all the sites, and therefore we selected 3, which are a little bit divided also spatially, more like in the northern part of the Flemish battlefield area, which is the Trench of Death at the River Iser. Tynecott, more like in the center of the area, and then to the southern part, Bayernwald, which means already that we have different kinds of sites. Tynecott, of course, being a cemetery, while, as you see, Trench of Death is more like a trench complex. Bayernwald as well, complexes of bunkers and things like that. But we have also sites of different origin. Trench of Death is more like Belgian-oriented. Tynecott is Commonwealth, and as the name says it, Bayernwald was a German site. You see that they are quite important, also different, although different in the number of visitors. Strangely enough, I didn't find specific figures for 2016. We have visitor figures for all of them, 2013, 2014, 2015, not on 2016. And to some extent it might have to do with declining numbers already in 2016. But another thing is that we may not forget that there was really a disturbance of visiting because of the terrorist attacks, especially among the Commonwealth visitors. But apart from that, these are the sites that we used as a basis, and where we did all these interviews, and where our protocols for the interviews were focused on this kind of topics that you may not know well if you are acquainted with the sense of place literature. But what is interesting as well is that to some extent there are elements already that later were incorporated in a publication that I will have with Caroline Winter, and called First World War Battlefield Tourism, Journeys Out of the Dark and Into the Light. In fact, the subtitle is meant to be a little bit of a rebellion, because this will be in a book on dark tourism. And none of us, nor Caroline nor I, like this dark tourism referring to battlefield tourism very much. But what is important is we focused on taboo. And from this notion of taboo, we focused on the question, is there a taboo in language, in discourse, and is there a taboo in behavior? I will not elaborate on that, but what might be important is to see, and it has been mentioned, the mediation of the landscape already in terms of behavior is certainly there. So this was also part of the research. Very quickly, a number of figures, because although we had small interviews, we tried to collect a little bit of service-like information as well for and a number of figures. And what is interesting is that at the 3 sites, one considers the site more, and you can see that one agrees that they are touristic places, but not only that they are really a place of recollection, they are really a heritage site, and that they are a place of learning. So the ordinary visitor, let's say, because we couldn't make any distinction according to social class or whatever. We had a random addressing of people coming in on the sites, And you see that, let's say, a mainstream visitor also sees this as a place of recollection. So you see a division on now and in the future, and you see that in the future, one is stressing even more the fact that these sites should be a place of recollection and a heritage site. And that, in fact, people do not want to think about this and to develop these as a touristic place. So to some extent, it's important to see that the visitor now and in the future want this to be places of recollection. It's kind of a very discomforting image that these sites would be turned into tourism places only. Another thing is that what do you experience during the visit? As you can see, and that's interesting as well. Recollection, of course, is very important there, but people feel empathy, which is kind of against literature, because there is a whole literature asking if a visitor can develop a sense of place. What makes people feel and develop a sense of place? And in general, the literature says, like, you should be on the spot during a long time before you can develop a sense of place, before you can develop empathy with the place. Well, here, in fact, it seems that people say they feel empathy with the place, which is interesting, because if you really have this, then you can build on that as well. Other elements, maybe I should have said Dodenhang, that's this trench complex in the north, Bayernwald, Teinkot, Which elements supports the significance of the place for you? We see that heritage is important everywhere, the material heritage, and then already what is interesting, and what was interesting at least for us, is that there seems to be a difference in interpretation between a cemetery and other kinds of sites. Like for a cemetery, Teinkot in this case, the symbolic value and other elements like maintenance contributing to the atmosphere seems much more important than on other sites, which for us was quite interesting to see that we tend to talk about sites in a battlefield area, but that there are different types and that people feel differently according to this type. The qualities, so especially during the second phase of our interview, we really asked and insisted on what makes this a memoryscape for you. And of course, there are the normal elements and the tangible elements. You will not be surprised that, for example, the historical attributes as the pattern of the trenches, or the accessibility, the epitaphs, but also the informative elements like photographs being present, that all of this was mentioned as a part of the quality of the heritage-scape, making it a memoryscape. But then again, there were other elements that seem to make a heritage-scape in a battlefield area real memoryscape. And this for us becomes important because it's a little bit going beyond what we know. And this is the insistence on the entity or the holistic element of the landscape, and referring indeed to the sense of scale. It's not about the epitaph, it's not about the monument, it's not about the single individual elements that witness, but it's about the entity. It's clearly said in the citation upper left, in a good way, in almost a scientific way, the landscape, does play an important role because it gives you a sense of scale, etc. The second citation is a little bit more clumsy, but in fact saying the same thing, just the whole thing. The Germans took the high ground. Well, in fact, it was a clumsy way of referring that you needed to understand the landscape, and you need to understand the composition of the different elements in the landscape. So even visitors insisted very much on these contextual elements in the landscape. Atmosphere, what you were stressing as well. Maintenance and respect, what Caroline just stressed. Many people said the fact that it is looked after, that it witnesses respect, is very important. And a last element, what made it interesting there, is that a lot of visitors focused on the behavior of others. For them, a memoryscape was not a memoryscape if the behavior of others was not appropriate. So there is really a taboo on what people do at such sites. Just to give an example about, again, another way of representing the qualities of the heritage scape at Tynecott Cemetery. And what is interesting to see is that if people make a ranking of the elements they think contribute to the quality of the memoryscape, that, for example, environment comes before material witness, because material witness means like the monument sensu stricto, the epitaph sensu stricto. So the material elements that refer to what happened there comes after environment and the embeddedness in the physical entity. Certainly in 2014, when we focused on the profile of the memoryscape, it really came first, and we see in 2013, when we more like focused on the experience of the visitor, it became very high in the ranking as well. So as kind of wrap up a little bit and try to summarize what might be the qualities then of a memoryscape, you kind of have elements, and this is in the middle in dark, that are applicable to all of them. But then you have some elements that are more like applicable to cemeteries, what we called sites of commemoration, and then others that are applicable to like trench complexes, bunker complexes, and things like that, which we called sites of imagination. And to some extent, we see some differences there. We see some different interpretations, different elements that were put to the front by the visitors, which might be important if you want to use these elements really to create or maintain or to improve the experience of the visitors there. Another thing is, going back to the landscape, is that a number of our interviewees mentioned the small things, like scale. Scale seems to be important, but the difference between the primary sites and the secondary sites was really very obviously present there for the visitors, and or they took the whole, like you see in the citation there on the left bottom. It's wonderful, lovely dispersed in the region. Strange thing to express, but what they wanted to say is that it wouldn't be so impressive if the small things were not there, like the indications, how do you say in English, the signs, the street signs, they are kind of everywhere, and for some people this was quite impressive. The little cemeteries, you have Tuinkot, one of the biggest ones in Europe, but in fact they were referring to the very quiet ones with only a few graves, and with as you see, the cows grazing around it. So this made us realize that talking about memoryscape and talking about maybe paying more attention to the small scale and even to the empty might be an interesting element there.
I think I recognize that donkey, actually. I've seen it before.
Yeah, that's at Polygon Wood. Yes, that's yeah, absolutely. So the donkey is still there. That's the guardian. That's the guardian. But that's what the people said, that in fact this embeddedness in the present day landscape, with the normal rural activities along, for some of the small ones, you have to cross the courtyard of a farm, and the farm coming out and saying, hey, where are you from? Oh, we had visitors from your region yesterday. All this is contributing very much to the experience, really. So, as a conclusion, first thing is that we tend, well, some literature tends to talk about the memoryscape, but that the memoryscape does not exist. So you have different types. I think that we were quite successful in kind of trying to grasp the big distinction between sites of commemoration and sites of imagination already there, that it is important to take this into account. Another thing is that place satisfaction and place attachment can be there, even among visitors, but that the contribution of the physical environment is very important, and that landscape of a mediator, like I didn't look into your way of putting, but it comes back like landscape as a mediator is very important. And then, of course, going back to tourism, we thought, like, if you want to make this commemoration or continue after the commemoration period, that first of all, you should not say, like, it's not possible to give visitors an in-depth sense of place. It seems that it is possible, but that you kind of maybe have to create more what you mentioned, inclusiveness. I think that, and that the anonymous space, the small space, might be a very interesting space, because it, more probably than the big memorial sites, they create an opportunity for encounters between host and guests, for example, between the locals and the visitors. And that, in fact, thinking about the preservation of the battlefield sites over a long period, I think we in tourism tend to think that you should create kind of an alliance between hosts and guests. The big question is, how do you do that? So probably, and to some extent, the small spaces with the landscape that kinds of contributes to the commemoration might be a very interesting asset there, we think. Now, very last slide, coming back to the commemoration period. What we see is, and I just took that yesterday evening from a report from the Flemish Tourism Board, a research about awareness World War I in 2016. And what is interesting is that the answer to the question, according to you, how important is it to commemorate World War I? That you see a rise during the commemoration period with every nationality, and even especially among the German visitors. And therefore we think that the commemoration period is very important because it creates awareness and it creates openness to go beyond. And that would be my final impression here.
Thank you, Dominique. I'm trying to make sense of that graph, but yeah, I see those.
You see, you have 2013, 2016, and then you have the nationalities, where each of the nationalities, except the Dutch, are split up in two groups. Like for Belgium, the Dutch-speaking and the French-speaking. For the Germans for North Rhine-Westphalen, which are the group that is most related to this area, but also the other German visitors. And then you have the French from the north of France, Ile-de-France, Nord-Pas-de-Calais, and the other French, and then the Dutch are taken as one group.
And so these figures are people who are visiting?
Yes.
So there are already people who have an interest in the First World War?
Yes, absolutely. But for sure, the commemoration period rise the fact that they were really convinced that it is important to commemorate World War I. You see, a lot of them were in the very beginning, like in 2013, not at all convinced. And you see that very important to commemorate rises with all the nationalities. Now, the fact as such is interesting, but I think we can build on that. It's therefore that I show the graph. We can build on this rising awareness as to kind of motivate the visitors to go into this alliance with locals, to go into this more contemplative commemoration. And maybe a last element there is that you see very interesting developments in tourism as well, called slow tourism. So not the quantity, but the quality, not the rushing through different places, but the contacts with the locals. And that in fact, this kind of a trend in tourism might be easily linked with what happens in battlefield areas and how you can kind of motivate these slow tourists as to engage into this reflection together with locals or with other visitors, by the way, because